yourselves comfy. You're in there, and you two are here. Down here. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Cambridge Festival event from the Cambridge.
And some water.
First talk we have this evening is called How Do Wars End, and I'll pass you over to Chris Mann to host that in a moment. And if anybody had this book, wants to stay around with the second talk this evening at 8 p.m. called From Science Fiction to Science Fact, featuring this from the Royal School of Martin Rees. You're welcome to be here. Do look for our staff if you need any assistance at all. We're wearing a kind of a festival hoodie or a festival t-shirt. But enjoy your evening, and I'll pass you over to Chris Mann. Chris Mann.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome. How are we all? Everybody good? Can you hear me all right? Yeah, welcome to the oldest continuous debating chamber in the world, which is a nice place to be. It's a bit of a treat for us. We have, I know there's one missing at the moment, we have 4 top academics to talk to you. Professor Sir Richard Evans is fighting his own battle with the M11. I think I'm just seeing him coming in the door right now, actually. So he's been stuck in a traffic jam. We've just been holding off for Richard to arrive now, and then we'll get underway. Wanted to ask if we're obviously going to talk about how do wars end. I wondered if I'd just ask you, anyone want to guess how many, according to the official figures of the Geneva Academy, how many wars there are right now going on in the world? Anybody want to guess? I asked in the office earlier on, and I got 5 and 6 and 10 and 20 as the guesses. Does anybody want to guess how many wars there are in the world at the moment? 50? Any advance on 50? 100. 110 is the official figures right now. Richard, welcome. Nice to see you, sir. Please have a seat. Richard Evans, everybody.
I didn't mean to make an entrance, but I was held up on the 11th by a huge traffic jam.
So just getting everybody warmed up. So there's 110 conflicts at the moment. That doesn't include those going on inside the Conservative Party, obviously. Some of those have lasted a few months. Some have lasted 50 years. There's 43 in the Middle East and North Africa, 35 in the rest of Africa, 21 in Asia, 6 in Latin America, 7 in Europe. The longest war in history, anybody want to guess how long that was? Do we know? It was 781 years. It was the Reconquista between Spain and the Moors. And the shortest war ever lasted for 30 minutes one afternoon in 1896. Britain turned the gunboats on Zanzibar, and it was all over very quickly. 500 people died in those 30 minutes, but that's the shortest war ever. There's wars obviously happening all over the world right now, and there's been, even just since this debate was organized and the panel was chosen, there have been many more to join that list, sadly. So what we're going to try and get to over the next hour and a half, and we're going to invite you to ask questions very shortly, by the way. So please store those up and get ready to ask. But we're going to try and get to the bottom of how wars end, what happens when they end, how best we can cope with that, and the sort of cultural and other differences that happen in that time. So our last arrival is going to be our first guest. He is a former President of Wolfson College, Cambridge. He is the Emeritus Regius Professor of Modern History, and I think acknowledged greatest expert, living expert on Nazi Germany. And his latest book, Richard, is The Pursuit of Power, Europe 1815 to 1915. So Professor Richard Evans is going to kick us off with 8 minutes, please.
8 minutes, right. I don't guarantee it. Might be 7, might be 9.
Okay. We'll settle for 8.
All right. Well, first of all, again, apologies for turning up at the absolute last minute. It was a car crash which did not involve myself, but held everything up on the M11. Okay, right. So how do wars end? Roughly, there's just a very few ways. Of course, this is a very big generalization, but first of all, and most obviously, wars end by the outright, complete and total victory of one side over the other. And we can look at 1945 for this. The Allies' defeat of Germany and Japan in 1945. These are 2 different dates, but it's a global conflict, World War II, and it was, of course, based on unconditional surrender demanded by the Allies of Japan, and then before that of Germany. You can think of plenty of other total victories. The victory of a different set of allies over Napoleon, for example, in 1814, and then briefly again at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. That, obviously, that complete victory is what the participants in wars all hope for. That's what they want when they start. That's what certainly Vladimir Putin hopes for over Ukraine. His aim is to completely occupy Ukraine and incorporate it into Russia. That is what the Ukrainians hope to do, although the kind of victory they want is simply to expel the Russians from their territory. In Gaza, and those two I think are the major conflicts relatively close to us in Britain, in Gaza, the extreme right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu and his allies hope to completely defeat Hamas, which rules the Gaza Strip. Hamas is a little unclear, less clear, but essentially they want to wipe Israel off the map. You can see that in the 1988 covenant, for example, and it's a war aim of at least some of the Palestinian groups that support them. The problem here is, of course, that the complete victory is not what's likely to happen either in the Ukrainian conflict or in Gaza, but at the moment that seems to be the aim. And of course, victory, the achievement by one side of its aims in a conflict with another, is more common if the aims are limited. If it's a matter, as in, for example, 2013 to 14, of Russia simply taking Crimea from Ukraine. But that's one way in which wars end. Then secondly, you can have a negotiated peace, of course. There are many different ways in which both sides agree to negotiate a peace. It was more common perhaps in the 18th century with with cabinet wars, with relatively clear and limited aims. For example, Frederick the Great, Friedrich II of Prussia, in 1740, taking the province of Silesia from the Habsburg Empire and calling it a day there. And of course, Bismarck's wars of German unification were clearly directed at unifying Germany under Prussian leadership. The generals who, when they defeated Austria, wanted to go on and occupy Vienna were stopped from doing so by Bismarck, who had realized, of course, that in the future Austria had to be an ally of Germany, or Prussia-Germany. So limited aims, both sides in the end agreeing in many cases that they're not going to achieve their objectives. 1918, the end of World War I here, the generals in Germany realized they were not going to win in the face of huge numbers of American troops coming in, massive Allied superiority in the production of tanks, which had overwhelmed them in 1919. So they concluded a peace before, at a time when German troops were still occupying parts of France and Belgium. So a negotiated peace, that I think is probably, in the longer run, the most likely outcome in Ukraine and Gaza, but at the moment there's no sign of any of the combatants realizing they're not going to achieve their aims. Then you've got outside intervention. Sometimes it's the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, which incidentally everybody seems to have forgotten about now, saying that the Ukrainian conflict is the only war in Europe since the Second World War, or but the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, an 8-country coalition, including Russia and the United States, forced a settlement on the warring parties, above all Serbia, in 1999. And that's, of course, can happen only where the outside forces are too massive to be resisted. Or, to bring my brief sort of list to an end, I'm sure it's not complete, you can have a kind of gradual subsiding of conflict when some kind of stalemate is ended. So in the Iraq War, the first Gulf War in 1993, for example, Saddam Hussein was expelled from Kuwait, but the Allies did not go on to then try and change the regime by toppling him. And it was a kind of an uneasy armed peace settled. So those are the ways in which wars end. It's not very neat, it's pretty messy, but that's my rough list of how they end.
Thank you, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Richard Evans. 6.5 minutes, very impressive, I'm going to say. There's some water there, Richard, if you want to. Thank you for rushing in from the M11. Now, I didn't mention earlier on, but I was an eyewitness to a war. I was a Moscow correspondent in the 80s, so the Cold War, which I think the Americans say is the most expensive war of all time, $8 trillion and counting. Of course, it's started up again, hasn't it? So I'm really looking forward to hearing our next speaker. Ayse Zarakol is Professor of International Relations at the University of Cambridge, Emmanuel College. And her most recent book is Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, which has won huge acclaim around the world and has won a lot of orders and a lot of prizes. And she's going to talk to us about what happens to countries after a war. Ayse.
Yes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm in international relations, but I'm not a conflict resolution scholar. What I work on is, one of the things I work on is status and state identity and grievances and humiliation narratives. What I want to use my time for is to talk about not how wars end, but why wars do not end and why they keep flaring up again and again. And that has something to do with, I think, identity and status. So, when we look at conflicts around the world, we have a tendency to think of them as very old. There's often a distant talk about, these are ancient hatreds. These groups of people have been hating each other forever. But in reality, most of the intractable conflicts and wars that we see flare up over and over again around the world, they're relatively modern conflicts, and the idea of them being ancient, centuries old, thousands of years old, is usually projected back in time. If you actually go back and study as a historian these places, you either find coexistence or other types of conflicts that don't cut across the same identity lines. So why is it that, modernity creates these intractable conflicts that seem very old and have a tendency to flare up again? I mean, in some ways, modernity has made the world safer, less conflict prone, but in other ways, the conflicts and the wars that we have are difficult to resolve. And I think that's because modernity has changed how people emotionally relate to wars. And that has something to do with nationalism and the nation state. Again, we tend to think of nations as very old things, but the nations that we know and that we experience personally, they are relatively of relatively modern vintage. And the way wars get inflicted through nationalism is that even if something is not happening directly to you, you feel that it is because you feel that you're part of this larger group. So it's my countrymen, members of my nation, members of my group that are suffering. And even if I'm not directly affected, I feel emotionally connected to their suffering. And not only to their suffering, but also people who've lived before me in the same nation. So it may be that my grandparents were harmed, but somehow that affects me. It seems to affect me directly. Now, compare that with older wars, it would be the King's War or some aristocrat's war. You're not, you may fight in it, you may suffer from it, but it's not, you fought in a conflict that you don't emotionally necessarily feel a part of. So that emotional connection makes wars very intractable. And that emotional connection, I mean, we can debate, what nations are, but the nation state often controls, the narrative of, how these wars were experienced by the group, and then reproduces that narrative through, historic curricula or like the way specific conflicts are explained, creating, a collective memory about, even if you were not directly there, you seem to have a collective memory as part of the nation. If the war ends in a way that the nation states want to make a story of humiliation or revenge or status loss or something, that is constantly reproduced in textbooks, in anthems, oaths, that from a very young age, children partake in, so that it becomes part of the socialization of the nation, and then that makes it very intractable because it means like your identity is involved in that conflict, doing something about it, getting revenge, getting even. So if we want to take lessons from that general story for like how the wars end, how do we make sure that the war doesn't become a part of a country's, a nation's identity? We have to somehow disrupt that process of narrative building and reproduction. In a way, people's identity and their status and their sense of being in the world is not involved necessarily in that war. So one way you can do that is if an outside party, for instance, comes in and starts controlling or shaping the post-war narrative. I mean, to some extent, this has happened in Japan, in Germany, right? You don't let the defeated party write history from scratch or like an account of the war. You make sure that there is a kind of an accounting or a narrative that is that makes peace possible. Otherwise, the story of loss, defeat, humiliation again becomes part of the post-war story. Or you spin the humiliation or defeat narrative into something productive towards pacifism, so like a new state identity, learning something from it, atoning, right? A positive message has to be given. One way of doing that is creating a settlement that does not allow for a humiliation narrative, right? If the defeated party, preserves some degree of dignity, can concoct some kind of story out of it from which they can still preserve their self-respect. Again, that might be a way of disrupting that, this was so humiliating for us, we must get back and get revenge narrative. It's not a guarantee because sometimes these revenge narratives are also relatively untethered from what happened. It may happen that the central state still wants a revenge narrative, but it's one way of increasing the odds, allowing the defeated side to have some kind of positive spin. And the third way, of disrupting that process is, maybe disrupt that link the regular people have with the state. Well, of course, you can't really disrupt their link with the state or the nation, but maybe at least the leadership. So there is this strong tendency to blame the whole group because sometimes they deserve it. I mean, they participate in this war, they've supported it, but it is perhaps more productive to allow them an out, the regular people an out, so that they will accept the peace and not seek revenge, blame, pick some scapegoats and make them responsible. People may have ethical problems with that, but in terms of creating long-lasting peace that doesn't get mired in stories of revenge and humiliation, that's one way of doing it. And those are my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you. Elegantly put. So 2 senior professors from Cambridge University. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Ayse. I don't know if all of you realise, but there actually are universities outside of Cambridge. And, we've got 2 representatives from University College London. I'm delighted to say, first of all, Dr. Uilleam Blacker is one of Britain's leading translators from Ukrainian. Where would you find one of those? Well, he grew up on the Scottish island of Barra, naturally. He's written, well, he was actually an International Booker Prize judge last year, but Associate Professor of Ukrainian and East European Culture at University College London, and the author of Memory, the City and the Legacy of World War I in East Central Europe. Uilleam.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you so much to the Cambridge Festival for the invitation. So I'm going to speak specifically about the war in Ukraine, because that's what I know about as a scholar of Ukraine, its history and its culture. The first thing to say about how does the war in Ukraine end? How does Russia's war against Ukraine end? The first thing to say is that most likely it could have ended by now. If things had been different in the first days, weeks, months of the war, after the full-scale invasion of February 2022, if the reaction of the West had been more decisive, things could have gone differently. We saw how the Ukrainians themselves, with no assistance, managed to push back the attack on Kyiv. With limited assistance, they managed to make huge gains in occupied parts of the country around Kharkiv and Kherson. There were moments when it looked as if the Ukrainian army really had the advantage and the Russian army was in something of disarray. But the chance to throw ourselves behind Ukraine to give it everything it needed was not taken. You know, I was standing on just outside Downing Street in the first days. One of the chants was close the sky. You know, people wanted a no-fly zone. People wanted anti-aircraft capabilities. Those things were not forthcoming. Then when they were forthcoming, they were only partially forthcoming. If we had been quicker, if we had thrown ourselves behind Ukraine, we don't know. But I think there's a good chance that Ukraine could have actually driven the Russians back, at least to the February 2022 lines. And I think that question of decisiveness, of courage, and of commitment to your aims is very, very important when thinking about how a war is going to go, because hesitancy, fear, timidness doesn't seem to pay off, especially when you're facing an opponent like Russia, which can smell timidness, which can smell cowardice. How will it end? Well, I don't know, but people talk about negotiation, people talk about compromise. I think we have to think about what that means. You know, it's nice to talk about, let's all sit down and talk things through and find a solution. But what does that mean? What positions are the negotiating sides negotiating from? Positions of strength or from positions of weakness? What does a compromise mean? People often talk about territory in Ukraine. You know, let's give Russia a bit more territory than what it already took in 2014. Well, territory, first of all, isn't just territory, it's also people. People live on the territory. If you let those people, if you let those territories go to Russia, those people go to Russia, and they live under a system which denies them their rights, which will try to destroy their cultural identity, which operates with torture, with filtration camps, with concentration camps, with rape as a weapon of war. So if we talk about compromise on territory and people, we have to understand that that's what we are proposing. But also the thing I think to remember about compromise is that in a compromise, both sides get something. That means that the aggressor gets something. So the aggressor is rewarded for the aggression. This has happened with Russia multiple times recently. It happened after 2014. There was really no real consequences for Russia after it annexed Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. We continued to buy its oil, we continued to trade. The sanctions were very mild. Russia basically got away with it. It was rewarded for the aggression. But we can go back further. We can talk about Syria, we can talk about Georgia, we can talk about Chechnya. This is a pattern. It's a pattern for Putin, and it's a pattern for Russia. So if we compromise, we reward the aggressor, and we've seen that this is precisely how not to end wars. This is how wars do not end. If you reward aggression, you encourage further aggression, you encourage further war. That's what's been happening with Russia. It's a very, very clear pattern. What happens if and when this war ends? I mean, I guess it will end at some point. We have to think about how to break that pattern. And I think here, just to refer back to some of the things that Ayse was talking about, we have to think about the cultural, historical, the social sides of wars and of the societies that go to war. Russia went to war not just because Putin wanted to go to war. He was able to mobilize the Russian elites, political elites, the military, and large parts of the population. Of course, we can debate to what extent we can be sure that there is support for the war, but I think it's pretty clear that there is some, if not significant degree of support for the war. How was that possible? And we have to look back at the history that allowed this to happen. We in the UK, we've been going through sort of torturous discussions about our own imperial past. If we think about, with greater or lesser degrees of success, we could think about Germany and how it, again, with all the problems and blind spots and faults of the process by which it came to terms with its past after the war. These processes happen in various contexts, but they've never happened in Russia. And this is certainly one of the things that makes it possible for this type of aggression, for the wars to keep recurring with such regularity. So if we want the war to end, somehow from somewhere there has to be a process of decolonization, de-imperialization in Russia, coming to terms with the multiple acts of aggression that it's committed against its neighbors throughout, not just in the post-Soviet period, but the Soviet period as well, the pre-Soviet period as well. There has to be a deep process of historical reckoning. It's very, very difficult to see where that's coming from, because the people who try to do that in Russia, like the representatives, for example, of the Memorial Society, these people end up in jail. It's interesting that Russia really targets the people who try to do these things. But if it's not going to happen again, this is a process that has to happen, and that's something that has to come from Russian society itself. From Ukraine's point of view, what has to happen so that war ends decisively? It needs geopolitical security, so it needs integration into NATO and into the European Union to deter further aggression from Russia. It needs defensive capabilities, so it needs something like an Iron Dome type system. It needs to fortify its borders. It needs the support of NATO partners. And it also needs a lot of investment for a fair and comprehensive reconstruction process so that it can thrive as a post-war society. But before we get anywhere near any of that, we have to go back to the first steps and the beginning of my remarks, and that is the importance of arming Ukraine right now, because we're still dragging our feet with the aircraft, with the long-range missiles, and if we don't take those steps, we're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you, William. And just a reminder, we'll take questions shortly, and I see some people from Ukraine, Cambridge for Ukraine in the crowd this evening. Very pleased to welcome you. Our fourth speaker, also from UCL, is Professor Kristin Bakke, who is the Professor of Political Science and International Relations at University College London, but also works at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and is going to talk to us about the legacy of wars.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. So I spent the last few years working on the legacies of armed conflict in different ways, looking at particularly how it affects ordinary people's attitudes, doing public opinion surveys in places that have experienced armed conflict and that are undergoing armed conflict, like Ukraine. And we know that armed conflict have legacies on people. Experiences of violence affects political trust, it affects community trust, it affects people's views of the other, the groups that they've been fighting against. It affects political identities long into the future. It passes through generations. So wars, there's not a neat boundary between you have a war and then it ends and everyone lived happily ever after. Wars have long-lasting legacies on people's attitudes. Wars also have institutional legacies, and I'll spend most of my time now talking about some of those. So Richard talked about the various ways in which wars can end. We can have military victories, and we can have peace settlements, and then we can have these kind of in-between or no solution outcomes where there's a military stalemate, but no one clearly wins, there's no peace agreement, so the conflict at the heart of the war remains. And one variety of this is what leads to the emergence of so-called de facto states in international system. So we tend to think of the state system as existing of 192 states. They're nicely portrayed on the Ayse's dress here. We have the map of the world. But then we have, since World War II, there's been the birth of about 20 of what we think of as de facto states or unrecognized states. And these are typical entities that are geographic, political entities that are born out of violent struggles. So they're territories that want to split from the state that they're part of. They fight a war, often long-lasting, brutal war, and no one clearly wins, and there's no peace agreement. Yet, the state that these entities are trying to split from, so think about Nagorno-Karabakh, officially part of Azerbaijan and now has been recaptured fully by Azerbaijan, Abkhazia in Georgia, Somaliland in Somalia. The so-called parent state that they're officially part of has no control in that territory any longer, but these entities are not recognized by the rest of the states in the national system as states, so they become unrecognized states. But they look like states, they function like states, they have national anthems, they have military, some of them have their currency, they have education systems. But the rest of us don't recognize them as states, so they become these kind of in-between units in a national system, and the rest of us don't quite know how to deal with them. So that is one sort of unusual outcome of wars, particularly of separatist wars or territorial wars. But it shows, that it's about these legacies, institutional legacies, and some of these entities last for years or decades on end. And there's really only two ways in which you can sort of die as a de facto state. Either you become an independent state, like South Sudan did, so you're no longer an unrecognized state, or you are recaptured by the parent state, which happened to Chechnya, it happened to Nagorno-Karabakh in the fall, last fall. Another legacy of a sort of institutional legacy, sort of short of de facto state, is that in many armed conflicts, we know that we tend to think of the armed actors in civil wars in particularly. We talk about them as the rebels, and we're focusing on the violence that they're committing. But most armed actors, or many armed actors, also engage in ruling while they are during the war. And that can have long-lasting legacies. So a few years ago, I was doing a survey in Northern Ireland about people's attitudes to the peace agreement. And I was talking to the survey company about, how we were going to sample and, to get a national representative survey. And then they said, yeah, there are certain neighborhoods in Belfast and Derry/Londonderry where we're going to have to, particularly in Belfast, we're going to have to negotiate with the paramilitaries about getting access to certain neighborhoods. And I was like, what? I was completely shocked that there are areas in Belfast you would have to negotiate with the paramilitaries more than 20 years after the peace agreement to get access to. So I started looking into this much more. And in Northern Ireland, since every year, there's about 100, in certain areas, there's about 100 so-called paramilitary-style attacks or punishment attacks. And those are attacks by paramilitary groups on members of their own community. So they're trying to sort of, quote-unquote, police their own communities, often going after drug dealers. It's a bit unclear whether they're concerned about drug dealing or really want to control the drug dealing themselves, going after people for antisocial behavior. But about 100 attacks. And that's the reported attacks. So clearly, the number is probably much higher. And I started looking into, well, why is this and where is this? And how do we explain that this is persisting in this post-war society, that in many accounts we see as a successful post-conflict society, a peace agreement we see as successful because there hasn't been a recurrence of the armed conflict. And we looked into, we collected data on where these attacks are happening, and then we mapped them onto where did paramilitary groups control areas during the troubles, during the 30-year-long conflict. And we saw that, there's a correlation between the areas they controlled during the conflict and that they're seeking to control today. That still sort of begs the question, well, why? Why is this? And there's a couple of mechanisms. One, there's a top-down mechanism. You have armed groups that for either political or criminal reasons want to control certain areas. And they look to areas that their paramilitary predecessors used to control, and they seek to control them today. There's also more of a bottom-up sort of mechanism, kind of a socialization mechanism. And that is that if for some people who for 30 years lived in areas that were controlled by paramilitary groups during the Troubles, and they got used to the fact that there were certain tasks that were conducted by the paramilitary groups as opposed to the state. So in 1969, when the conflict in Northern Ireland flared up and the army moved in, the police moved out of certain areas. But people still, of course, needed policing. So they started going to the paramilitary groups for antisocial behavior, for example, in certain areas. And if that happens for 30 years, there's like this norm developing in certain areas that that's kind of what you do. You just don't go to the police. And, I've spoken about Northern Ireland. I'm going to wrap up now. But it's not just about Northern Ireland. This is something we see in many post-war societies. This social control that armed groups have during conflict remains often in the aftermath of armed conflict. So, we talk about wars often, and then we talk about the post-conflict period. But it's a blurry boundary, and wars have long-lasting legacies.
Thank you. All very interesting. I'll take your questions in a moment or two. I wanted to ask the panel, you mentioned Northern Ireland at the end. I mean, that partly came to an end, didn't it? Because the big brother of America got involved and put their money in and their resource, although the IRA clearly wanted a solution to it all. That picture, isn't it, that we can see there, that How Do Wars End, is the Arc de Triomphe, which was inspired by Napoleon's attempt to conquer Europe. And there it is. I think that's from the Second World War. It's an iconic picture, isn't it, when it was liberated, the day when the British liberated after the German occupation. And it was said then that the United Nations or the League of Nations before would help stop wars. That hasn't happened. So can the panel give me their views? Is there some way that a bigger force can stop wars or get involved to be the referee like the Americans have been in Northern Ireland? Richard? Is that a hope?
It depends, of course.
You're on.
Yeah. Of course, a larger, more powerful force can end a war, as I said in my introductory remarks, as of the Balkan Wars of the 90s. I mean, an alliance of 8 of the most powerful countries in the world is in a position to force very small countries like Serbia to bend to its will and stop the fighting. I think that shows that really there's no, I mean, what the interwar years, the League of Nations, which was designed to stop war, it was meant to be a kind of negotiating forum to resolve conflicts. And it was a failure almost from the very beginning. It had no teeth. It didn't have any armed force of its own. The United Nations does, but it hasn't been a lot more successful. And it always has to be either an intervention from outside, an overwhelming force, or a compromise between the warring parties. And when you have, as in World War I, or now, as in Ukraine, you have, each side has backing from larger entities, whether it's America or whether it's China and India, and then it gets a lot more difficult.
Thoughts on that? I mean, the Middle East, fueled by big powers, is it not? Continuously, could they not do more to stop it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly more pressure could be brought to bear. But I think that what that accomplishes is perhaps a pause. Things have to change on the ground for there to be a lasting peace. Yeah.
Any evidence in your studies of outside forces, could, should, do more, can achieve things?
Well, there's lots of research on this, and the research is, some of it is divided, but there's a fairly recent study by Howard and Stark, and they looked at these various outcomes that Richard was talking about: military victories, negotiated settlements, and they show that the trends, how this develops over time, depends a lot on what the norms in the international system are for the preferred outcome for wars, and that depends a lot on what's the preferred outcome of the major powers, right? So in the Cold War period, you had a large number of conflicts ended in civil wars, in particular ended in military victory, because that's what the great powers were preferring. From the end of the Cold War till about 9/11, there was a rise in negotiated settlements, because that's what the major powers, particularly the United States, wanted. But then after 9/11, there was more of the rise of we don't want to negotiate with terrorists, so we saw a decline in negotiated settlements again. So what the major powers want really influences how wars end. I mean, we saw the vote in the Security Council today, right? I mean, don't need many. Clear
Uilleam?
example.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Ukraine, bigger partners could make a difference, and they are making a difference. Obviously, the support of the US, the EU is helping Ukraine, but like I said, there is a certain timidity, hesitancy. Russia is already presenting the war in Ukraine, its war against Ukraine, to its own public as a war against the West. And I think the West has sort of been caught, if we understand the West as basically, the US, NATO, has found itself caught in this kind of trap of not wanting to fulfill that and make that true, and being hesitant for that reason.
Is that a tactic you would endorse?
Well, I mean, nobody's ever forgotten the outbreak of the First World War. I think it's probably true to say that historians expend hugely much more of their energy and intellect on figuring out how wars start, and not that much on how wars end, which is one reason why this is a really interesting meeting. But World War I, everybody knows, started with the Serbian-backed, it seems, assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne, and then the Austrians wanted to punish Serbia, and then the Germans backed them, and then the Russians backed the Serbs, and just within a short space of time you have a world war. And that is what people nowadays are really, really worried about. So that's a major reason for NATO's hesitancy about getting involved in the Ukrainian conflict, because then if you can escalate it, you've got nuclear powers involved, and that's nobody wants that whatsoever. There's another factor, which of course is ideologies, and the Northern Ireland conflict is a much smaller kind of scenario. Of course, religion is a driving force. It's Protestant versus Catholic, which we find very difficult to understand, but that's what it seems to be. I mean, I was in Northern Ireland in 1969. I was on a cycling tour, and I got into the back streets of Derry, into a Protestant area. In 1969, I had no idea that the Protestant extremists were so fanatical. Yeah. And that was when the moon landings were just about to happen, and I could see graffiti on the walls. It was Belfast and Derry, great places for graffiti at the time. And one said, "Keep the Pope off the moon." And the other one said, "Put the Pope on the moon." And this kind of obsession that relates everything to your ideology.
Final question before we go to your questions in the audience, and try and get a straight answer out of you. You mentioned Putin and his threat. So he says that he'll use nuclear weapons. What do you say to a man that threatens you with nuclear weapons? Who'd like to go first on that? Do you call his bluff?
I think you were interrupted last.
Yeah, do you call his bluff?
Yes.
I mean, it depends what you mean by call his bluff, but
what do you want to do?
I think you don't back down. I think you don't back down, because that just means that the threat works, and it has worked.
Ayse?
I mean, just picking up from the last discussion, I mean, it's not just that there is a fear of spiraling. The American domestic, Americans are not behind the war wholeheartedly, and therefore Europe is, I think, a bit hesitant to act on its own without the Americans. So, yeah, I guess ideally, there would be a stronger front which would act as a deterrence, but Putin smells weakness, as you said. Yeah.
Kristin?
I think these two have given a good answer already.
So you call his bluff, do you?
Yeah.
Richard, as the expert on Adolf Hitler, what do you say?
Right. Well, that's a different crowd. I was just about to say 1914, everyone was calling everybody else's bluff, and you end up with the biggest war in history. So at some point, people have to be different. Prospective combatants have to be prepared to compromise. And politics is the art of the possible, as Bismarck once said. So as for World War II, that's an example of the importance of ideological fanaticism. Hitler wanted, believe it or not, to conquer the world. He said at one point in 1930, before he came to power, that the previous division of the world in the so-called scramble for Africa had excluded Germany. Germany only got the kind of least important bits of the division of Africa. But next time, he said, it's going to be different. We are going to control the world. And there's indications that had he won in Europe, he would have gone on to launch a campaign against America. So it's kind of limitless, without limit of time or space. And the other thing is, it's also important, preparedness to live without war. And for Hitler, of course, the war, perpetual, continual warfare, was the only way in which a race, as he thought of the Aryan German race, could actually survive and prosper. And for Putin, I think having a war rumbling on is quite useful internally. He's not doing very well within Russia itself. The economy is falling to bits. He's applying more and more kind of authoritarian methods, but it's telling all the Russians, oh, we're fighting against a real enemy. Russian soldiers are losing their lives, and what for? That's a good way of getting them to back you.
Thank you all. Right, it's your turn now. Questions, please. Who'd like to ask the first question? I recognize the lady there, Anna Staraskevich, who's Ukrainian who lives in Cambridge and is part of the Cambridge for Ukraine.
Good evening. So
Campaign.
thank you all of you for your speeches, especially Dr. Blacker for saying it as it is. And I would like to ask about international law. And I will downscale my question to normally when we have a crime within a country, we have ready processes and procedures on how to deal with criminals. We go to court and we bring them to justice. So with the example of Ukraine, it's important to remember the referendum, the memorandum in Budapest in 1994, when Ukraine signed the agreement that we will give up the nuclear power. We were the third power in the world with that, but instead we will get the reassurance that our sovereignty and our borders are protected. And the UK, the US, and Russia signed the referendum. So I guess my question is, well, I had two questions. One is, from your experience and from history, was there an example in history where a war was prevented by imposing international law, or was quickly stopped after it was started by imposing international law? And my second question is probably a little bit simple in its nature, but it comes from frustration, so excuse me. What's the point of the international law if it doesn't work? Thank you.
William?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important question, and it's why the question of justice, post-war justice, is going to be so crucial. I mean, it's what, we've talked about how to stop wars recurring and how to stop them not just stopping and then starting again. We have to punish the people who start the wars, and we have to punish aggression. Currently Putin is wanted for kidnapping children. He has kidnapped thousands of children, that's true, but we need more than that, and we need more than Putin and a few one or two people around him to be on those lists. So I think that's going to be really, really crucial. You know, ideally, we'd like to see a sort of Nuremberg for Putin after this, and that would be one way to show that international law does work, because international law hasn't prevented the war, but it could act if the international law is applied. It could act as a deterrent to Russia in the future.
Kristin, so you study legacies at the Peace Research Institute. Does your research show that Nuremberg-type trials put people off from starting wars or behaving badly during wars?
I haven't looked at that in my work, and there is work on that. I actually don't. Your question was very specific, an example where international law has actually prevented a specific conflict. And I'm now really trying to think.
It's very hard to prove,
to prove
a counterfactual. I mean, we don't know what it prevented in a way. Like if it prevented, it didn't. But,
Stop. Ayse?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big debate in international relations, whether international law actually accomplishes anything. And there are people who would say, no, it doesn't, because everybody does whatever they want anyway, there's no enforcement mechanism. At the same time, the fact that we have international law, like the fact that countries have to at least go through the motions, they sign things, it's just probably a constraint. I mean, even like elections, like Putin has to go through the motions of having an election. It's fake, it doesn't, but still it's something. It's changing behavior. It's having some kind of impact. It goes to legitimacy, it goes to have, you amass popular support, all of that. You remove international law, the world would probably be worse. It wouldn't be, like international law is not perfect and it's not like the solution to problems, but a world without it would probably be even worse. That's probably all we can say.
Richard?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, the Nuremberg war crimes trials and all the many hundreds of trials now forgotten of Nazi war criminals in Poland and France and many other countries after the end of the World War, they were able to achieve something, despite the fact they were flawed. I mean, for example, to start with, the presence of Wyszynski, the notorious Soviet prosecutor in the show trials in the 30s on the panel of judges, was a bit of, affected its legitimacy. But they did achieve something. Why did they achieve something? Why did the Bosnian, the Balkan Wars Tribunal achieve something? Well, because they reflected a position in which the people backing the trials were in a position, had absolute power. I mean, Milosevic and others had no way of countering their trials. The Nazi war criminals, they had no way. And when you've got somebody who stays in power, like Putin, it's not realistic to expect him to be prosecuted for war crimes.
But the Good Friday Agreement specifically allowed terrorists to walk free. They were released from prison, and others were not prosecuted on both sides.
And the International Court of Justice has only succeeded in prosecuting mostly African statesmen, African political leaders who are in no position to resist it.
Question from this side, please. Somebody with their hand up. Was there somebody there who'd like to ask? Yeah, gentleman here, hello.
Two questions. First, how does the panel see the options ahead for NATO in the Ukraine context? And the second question, what's your general assessment, taking a historical view of the level of geopolitical risk we face today?
Right, who'd like to go first?
Options ahead for NATO.
NATO and geopolitical. Have you got a particular iron in this fire? Is it no? Just interested. Good. Right, please.
I mean, I can say a little bit about. I'm not going to give you my view on NATO, but I'm going to give you survey evidence on Ukrainians' views on NATO. So I did a survey in Ukraine in 2019. It was a big project on geopolitical orientations in Russia's near abroad, and we had said when we applied for money, we wanted to do a follow-up because we thought big things were going to happen in the region. Obviously, didn't anticipate the disaster that has happened. And then we did a survey, and so that showed that about 40% of Ukrainians wanted NATO membership, and that's consistent with lots of surveys over time. So, enthusiasm, but not wild enthusiasm for NATO. When we asked more specific questions, do you want NATO troops stationed in Ukraine? It was much more lower support for it. And then we did a survey of the same people, or as many of the same people we could contact again in 2022, so into the war, and that was particularly in October 2022. It was a very violent month. And of course, the data shows, like we could all anticipate, that support for NATO is higher than it has ever been, before. We're in the process of doing another round now. So, you asked us what's our view, but it really isn't, it's about what our Ukrainians view is the central, I think, point here about what do they want. But, Russia was going to war allegedly to want to stop Ukraine from moving towards the West, but on any kind of indicator you could look at on how Ukrainians are positioned between Russia and the West, they've of course moved much further towards the West in their views.
Ayse, would you like to answer the question about the geopolitical situation? Would you just repeat it again? Sorry. Thank you.
So the second question is the panel's general assessment of the level of geopolitical risk in the world today. It's rather how do wars end? How does the world end?
Oh, okay. How close are we to midnight, I think is the question, isn't it? Yeah.
I think the general consensus is, to the extent that there's a consensus among IR scholars, is that we are in a period of disorder and geopolitical risk is increased greatly. There are more wars now than there were a decade ago, and they are not, because the world had become very connected, conflicts that would have been in a previous time disconnected are connected. So Russia and Ukraine, for instance, in the way like the global South is perceiving, like that's not disconnected from Israel and Gaza and other. So they're amplifying each other's effects, and that creates for a very volatile environment, unfortunately. So the risk is very high. Yeah. Yes.
If I may add to that, in addition to this growing trend in armed conflicts, there's also a concurrent trend of democratic backsliding. So we're seeing, more autocratic states and democratic rights even being under threat in well-established democracies like ours. And that's, obviously bad news for peace.
William?
Yeah, I was, last year I spent a bit of time in Japan, and I was very interested to see how the Japanese were watching Ukraine very, very carefully and were very interested in it. Firstly, because they're just concerned about what's happening, but also because they're worried about what happens if Russia is successful and China takes this as a precedent for attacking Taiwan. And what happens to Japan with its US military bases there? Does that mean that the whole region descends into war? So, again, to what I was saying about the danger of allowing aggression to be successful, rewarding aggression, it's not only for that aggressor, it's for other potential aggressors to see.
So,
just very quickly.
Yeah.
I get really a bit cross as a historian about how short people's memories are. So it's often said now that we live in a time of unprecedented danger and threat and war and so on. Try living in the 1930s, for example, when or even in the whole period of the first half of the 20th century, pretty much. You've got, we sometimes forget that the First and Second World Wars were what it says on the tin. They were world wars. And so huge amounts of the globe were involved in the wars because they're between global empires, not between nation states.
I didn't say this.
No, I wasn't referring to you at all.
So, and the lesson of that is right now?
Well, I think what makes it more difficult to judge, and what makes a difference, of course, is nuclear arms, which are vastly more dangerous than anything we saw in 1914, 18, or 1939 to the summer of 1945. We have the potential to destroy life on Earth, which was not the case with those wars.
Are you gloomy about that prospect? I mean, do you think nations might use it, or terror groups might use them?
I think it's possible. So far we've managed to avoid it. But it's certainly a possibility, I'm afraid.
Maybe we'll return to that subject. A question that... Oh, right. Gentleman here, hello.
Hi, good evening. Two items I'd like to pose to the panel. The first one is we've had the notion of a just war for a long period. I mean, even I think under the Romans there was a notion of just war. So how much does this help to prolong the war because you think you're riding the moral high horse, you have the legitimacy to continue the war, your aims are just, are justified and so on. The second one for me is, the title is How Do Wars End? But I think for many people the question really is, when does peace begin? And for me, more personal experience, I can only see one in relative recent history, and that is the long enmity between France and Germany ended now after 1945 with the formation of, essentially a predecessor to the European Union, and the friendship between France and Germany that then finally started after 45, because maybe both parties were finally too exhausted of their enmity to continue.
Let's go to the Peace Research Institute's Kristin for the first one. Listen, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yeah, or can I actually do the second one?
Oh.
Because this is one of the things I wanted to talk about, but I didn't have time in my 8 minutes. So when does peace begin? I mean, I think this is a very good question. And I think even how we talk about wars and how how do you know a war when you see it? And I know that sounds like a stupid question because we can all think of it, but it's like you have to decide, when do you consider an armed conflict to be a war? And typically you have some arbitrary threshold. Okay, when it reaches more than so and so many battle-related deaths, and then we talk about it as war, and then it goes below that level, and we don't count it as a war any longer. But that doesn't mean that the violence isn't there. Right? We know that in many post-war societies, you see so-called low levels of political violence continue for years on end. Right? For the people living in those societies, that doesn't necessarily feel like peace, right? Even though we might talk about it as a post-war or post-conflict society. We also know that in many societies that have experienced long and drawn-out armed conflict, criminal violence might be higher because you might have state capacity might be reduced. And again, that doesn't feel like, your question is when does peace begin? That doesn't feel like peace for the people who are living in those societies. Right? We tend to want to make these sort of neat boxes, war, peace, war or conflict, post-conflict. And again, the boundary there is quite blurry, and certainly for people living in these places.
Ayse, when does peace begin, in your view?
I mean, as I said in my opening remarks, like when people can kind of forget and move, and they're not kind of dwelling in the emotion of it. But could I say something about the just war question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I'm a Scotsman, I'm still dwelling about 1746, but, dwelling's an interesting concept, though, isn't it? You never let it go.
Dwelling, I guess, yeah.
Please, sir.
Yeah, I mean, the just war doctrine has a particular history that's like rooted in a particular European Christian tradition. And I think it was kind of a laudable idea to, generalize it and make it, a way of evaluating like when our war is just. But I don't think it ever like fully took hold for that reason, because it has that particular history. It's not cross-culturally shared. Having said that, I mean, I think when people engage in wars, nobody thinks my war is unjust. Like, people always think what they're doing is justified somehow. Like, otherwise they wouldn't do it. So it's very difficult to persuade. Like, if you're in war conditions, like, you have to believe what you're doing is just. So it's hard to make that like kind of a litmus test of behavior, I think.
Richard, does everyone always think they're justified in a war?
It's a complicated question when you start looking at the Nazis, because there's a couple of notorious speeches in part of occupied Poland, in Posen, by Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the main architect of the extermination of 6 million Jews. And he tells his SS men, nobody's going, essentially, what we're doing is really difficult. It's necessary. It is historical and racial necessity, but nobody is going to thank us for it. And they know, he knows that it's generally across the world regarded as unjust, but we have to do it anyway. As far as wars are concerned, I think Putin, again, appears to believe that he's justified. He seems to have entertained the illusion that the Ukrainians are all actually Russians, and they're just misled by a bunch of Nazis or neo-Nazis at the head, which is an absolutely ridiculous idea. Of course, it's completely fantastical, but that he seems to believe that that's genuine. You look at his bizarre lectures on World War II, for example. So it's generally true, of course. Each side in the war believes that what they're doing is justified.
And William, of course, the trouble is that the Russian public are being told that it's justified, and there's no way of them knowing any different, is there? Because they don't get the kind of information that we do.
I mean, yes. I think there is a question of access to information. There's a question of the effectiveness of propaganda. But people do have critical faculties. I think if they want to think critically about what they're being told, they can. I don't think everybody is necessarily fooled by this. I think a lot of people choose to believe because it's a lot easier to believe than it is to not believe and then face the possibility that you might have to act on that lack of belief in what you're being told. So I think the idea that people just don't know the truth, they're just fooled, they're just brainwashed, I think that takes away the agency of people. And I think people in Russia also do have agency. And of course, it's a very complicated question. It's very, very difficult.
It has to be organized, doesn't it?
It has to be organized, and Putin has obviously done as much as possible to make that impossible. We saw Alexei Navalny dying in prison recently, but this was not something that happened overnight. Putin's been in power for a couple of decades. People knew what type of ruler he was from early on. It's a creeping process. People repeatedly did vote for him, did endorse him. You still find a large degree of support for Putin in Russian society. So, the question of is Putin just ruling over Russian society with an iron hand? Did he sort of appear out of nowhere and take up this position of dominance? I'm not sure. There's also the question of where does Putin come from? He didn't come out of nothing. In many ways, I think we have to consider how Russian society produced Putin as well.
The dark forces of the KGB never went away.
Certainly, yeah.
Gentleman here at the front, we've got a microphone there, thank you. Here, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. I'm intrigued by the Russian people. When Gorbachev was in power, he gave up huge territory, whole countries, and the Russian people didn't rebel. They said, if Poland wants to be free, that's fine, we'll get on with our lives and they can get on with their lives. So if Putin was replaced by a more Gorbachev-like figure, and the war ended, I don't think the Russian people would really rebel and say, this is terrible, we need somebody like Putin back again. I think they'd accept that, and I think they'd let the Ukrainians get on with their lives.
Okay. But obviously the land that he gave up, you mean the other republics, so it was the Soviet republics that he gave up. Richard, a thought on that?
I think you know more about it than I do, actually, as a former Moscow correspondent.
Well, I don't think people put up with it, and because they went back to the old ways, and the people, the ordinary people didn't really have a say. It was the people in power who were very unhappy with it, the way things went, and what we're seeing now is a reaction to that. It's swung entirely the other way because they'll never let it go again. So as much as I'd like to think that's a nice idea, it just won't happen because the people that have a stranglehold over it all are waiting to take over when Putin leaves. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean...
There's not a liberal arm to the Russian government, is there, really?
Whether Russian people are liberal or I think when people feel stuck in a situation, they become a bit fatalistic, and then And then if you can't really help your situation, you don't see a way out, you kind of like want to, you have to deal, like even if you're not happy, you have to deal with cognitive dissonance. So you kind of create this fiction of having chosen it. I think some of that is going on with the Russians who've stayed. I mean, some voted with their feet, they left. Others maybe genuinely like support what's happening, but others, you know, as you were saying, William, like it's, the agency is in kind of choosing to believe because not believing would make you very unhappy. So like you say, oh, this is my choice. Like I like what is happening. Like it's easier to live with that than to be like constantly unhappy. Like if you don't think you can actually change stuff. Yeah, it's a way of dealing with dissonance.
And I think the only reason that Gorbachev gave up those territories because he knew he was losing the Cold War. And it was quite clear the Americans were so far ahead. And militarily they were losing, but also economically they were being crushed as well. So that's why he took the choice that he did. A man of the moment, yes.
Yeah. Just first of all, you know, the question of the Soviet Union or Gorbachev giving up lands, of course, the people in those places did a lot to take back their own countries. Yeah. You know, it is a kind of two-way process. But I think that, you know, the rebellion, Putin is the rebellion. The fact that Putin came to power is the rebellion against the loss of the empire. And Russians haven't learned to have a sense of national identity that isn't based on empire, that isn't based on, you know, greatness and dominance over their, you know, supposed sphere of influence. And that's the problem. Putin was the rebellion against the loss of that.
Peter the Great. Another question, please. There's a gentleman over there, just against the wall. Would that be all right? And then another one. Is there one over there afterwards? Yeah. Yes, thank you. This gentleman first, please. Okay, could you speak into the microphone, thanks?
Can you hear me okay?
No, could you speak into the mic? Thank you.
Still on the Ukrainian war, how do the panel see the possible dynamic changing should, God forbid, Trump get into power for a second term in America, where he's known for his America First policy, and he's known and he's voiced an opinion that the state shouldn't be supporting NATO, so he could undermine the power of NATO. And also, with the attrition of funding from European countries, how do the panel see, you know, a laudable outcome, as the gentleman there spoke about, is that overwhelming force pushes back Russia, and that's what we'd all like to see. But unfortunately, you could end up with a situation where you've got an absolute tyrant in charge of Russia, and you've got an idiot in charge of America, and they're two very dangerous people. And it all comes down to who's in charge of the powerful nations.
Thank you for your question. Thank you very much indeed for your question. So Donald Trump has said that he would end the war within the first 24 hours of being president. Is that hot air, or does he mean it, do you think? And could he do it?
No, I don't think he could do it. I mean, I think with Trump, you know, I think we'd have to wait and see what really happened with Trump. I think it's not going to be good for Ukraine either way. But to what extent Trump would really go in for sort of really overturning, you know, America's relationship with NATO and so on, I'm not sure that he would go that far. I think that there is an element of hot air to this, but it certainly we wouldn't be in the position that we're in now. I think it would be a lot more difficult for Ukraine. It would be much, much more difficult for Ukraine without American backing. Maybe we would have to see Europe step up a bit more in this, you know, and fill the vacuum. I think it could do more. It would be a huge challenge for Ukraine. But, you know, I think even in that situation, Ukraine will keep fighting. We will just probably see a different type of war, and we'll see a much longer war.
Richard Evans?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not terribly good at predicting the future. I remember I published an article saying that Germany was never going to be reunited in my lifetime, and it came out in August 1989. And ever since then, I've been very wary. But I think, you know, Trump. I think we should take Trump seriously. That's one of the problems, I think, over the past few years, that people have not taken him seriously. But he has the ability to win massive support and also to push some of his crazier ideas through. If he's elected, which is absolutely definite, it's a real possibility that he'll get elected in November. And then I think...
you get the youth vote.
Sorry?
You get the youth vote.
Well,
being the younger man. Yeah.
I don't know, yeah. Well, I mean, he looks a lot, seems and acts a lot as if he's a lot younger than Biden, whereas in fact he's actually not. Well, we'll have to see. I think what would happen if he might pull out all American support for Ukraine is a perfect possibility. We should not dismiss that as just hot air. And if that happens, as you say, the war will continue in a different form. If Russian troops occupy Ukraine, then there'll be a long, widespread guerrilla warfare, I think, because one of the effects of this war has been to really boost the Ukrainian sense of national identity and national pride. I think it's had that kind of effect, and that it's not going to go away overnight.
I say your book is about alternative global history of world orders. So if Trump gets in and he does this, might we see that shift of the plates as is predicted in world order?
Yeah. I mean, my work is historical, but yeah, I think there is a very strong chance that Trump will get elected, and he will, I think, use the threat of withdrawing support to force Ukraine into some kind of settlement that Ukrainians have said they won't accept. Then the question will become, like, what will Europe do? Because I think the rest of the world also wants some kind of negotiated settlement. They want the war to be over. They want Ukraine to accept some losses. They want to move on. You know, they are not on board with this in the same way like Europe is, or rhetorically Europe is. So yeah, and then that just leaves Europe, and I'm a bit pessimistic that Europe will actually step up. Because they say a lot, but with the exception of Eastern and Central Europe, I don't think the level of commitment is there, like genuine commitment. So the most likely scenario is yes, some kind of settlement that will make everybody unhappy, and another loss for like the West.
Kristin, what's your analysis?
Well, I agree with my fellow panelists what they've said. I guess one big question is what does it do to morale in Ukraine? In the survey we did in 2022, we asked people if they thought Western support would continue. And at that point, more than 60% thought that Western support would continue at a higher level than it was then. I don't know what it is now. We're in the process of doing another round of survey. I would imagine that there's more pessimism right now. And I think, but what we don't know much about is what does that do to sort of morale? What would it do to people's support for the war effort? I certainly think the war will continue in a different form, but would it mean that people think differently about possible outcomes? I think these are things we don't know, but it will have obviously effects on people's attitudes in Ukraine as well.
Just 5 minutes left or so. The next question is there. Thank you very much indeed, sir.
We talk about the war as being fought on several fronts, on the battlefield, economic and PR. By PR I mean the media and the social media. What we're seeing what I feel we're seeing is that the social media tend to have a big influence, not only on the countries that are at war, but on the countries that are backing the war. And that moves everybody's position. And I wondered how the panel saw the future going with the influence of social media and the fact that media is influenced by the country it's in.
You're talking about Ukraine here?
I'm talking about everywhere. I'm talking about Ukrainian with the West sees Russia as bad, okay. sees Ukraine as good. Israel, we're seeing America's influence changing. Is that because of the media? Is it because of social media? Okay. Gaza has no way of having any influence with social media.
So let's put that to the panel. Ayse would like to take that first. Is it being fought on X as much as anywhere?
I mean, I'll try to say something. I initially thought about talking about social media in my opening remarks, but then I thought it really complicates things, so I won't bring it up. But I do think it really complicates things, because when I was talking about that emotional involvement, now we can see like wars like unfold in like real time, like it's as if you're like there. So that that really increases in some ways the emotional resonance and makes it much harder to like climb back down. Like if once people have been mobilized like emotionally, it's hard for them to accept any kind of like truth or arrangement. At the same time, like so that's one possible effect. But at the same time, with all the AI and conspiracy theories and all of these like weird echo chambers, there's also like not knowing like what is happening and like suspecting what you see. So that it makes it very difficult to control the narrative, like the narratives that I was discussing, post-war narratives. They used to be centrally produced and disseminated through newspapers and textbooks. Now, like there are hundreds of narratives about like what is happening, who's responsible, who's to blame. With the attack on hospital in the initial month of the Israel-Gaza war, like it was who did it. Like we can find like 1,000 theories about like who did what, and they've been reversed and re-reversed, and people don't know. So it actually, I think, social media and people's immediate access makes post-war stuff very, very difficult and tricky.
Zelensky early on had a very good war, didn't he? And he seems to have gone quiet recently. I don't know whether that's deliberate or whatever else. But Ukraine initially fought the war very well on social media.
Well, Zelensky he's a media person. He comes from the world of television. He knows how to communicate, and he played the president on television before he became the president. So he had really very effective sort of training for that. I think, yeah, the Ukrainian state has used social media very well. The Ukrainian elites these days, in quite a contrast to the previous generation, for example, speak good English and are able to communicate on the international level very, very well, whether directly or on social media. I think one positive thing, I suppose, about social media in relation to the war in Ukraine is how it allows people within Ukraine to communicate and organize and mobilize. It's my Twitter feed is full of people collecting money for drones, for a particular unit, or for tourniquets, or for gloves or night vision, or for an evacuation vehicle. It's one of the things that Ukrainians have really used to shore up the war effort. And the Ukrainian army is, yes, it's a state army, but it's also a civilian army, which is not only made up of civilians, but in many ways supplied by civilian efforts and by civil society. And it's one of the remarkable things about Ukrainian societies over the last 10 years is the growth of civil society. And that civil society depends on communication and organization, and social media really helps that to happen.
At the Peace Institute, have you looked at the effect of social media on people's war efforts?
I haven't done that, but there are lots of people who have looked at this, and in general, I share some of Ayse's skepticism, but let me also point to some of the potential positives of social media. So in the case of the war in Ukraine, there's this initiative by scholars in the US and the UK called Data for Ukraine, where they use social media accounts to figure out where atrocities are happening and try to document, right, where atrocities are happening, who are doing them, and linking it back to our sort of previous discussion of the international law question, potentially that can help holding people to account, right? So that is sort of to add to, a more sort of going away from my inclination to be very negative about social media. There are ways in which it can potentially help hold people to account.
Richard, the whole business of claiming you've won and claiming you're doing the right thing and so on?
Yeah, well, we're drowning in a sea of disinformation, aren't we? And we're all struggling to find out ways of countering it. And of course, one of the most potent forces in spreading disinformation in the Ukraine war is Vladimir Putin, through his state-controlled media, Russia Today, for example. And the latest thing is trying to ascribe this horrendous atrocity in Moscow to Ukraine, which is absolutely no evidence at all. So how do you, if you live in Russia, how do you counter this enormous amount of disinformation that's coming out of the state-controlled media?
One last question. We've only got a couple of minutes to go. There's a young gentleman there. His hand up. Keep your hand up. There we are. Thank you. We'll get the microphone to you. And then some quick fire answers from the panel. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, the gentleman behind me touched on this, but a lot of the wars that break out, especially ones that are concerned with territory, like, you know, most recently we have Venezuela and Guyana, are concerned with feelings of justice. Do you feel that justice is an important prerequisite for peace? And if so, do you feel that those parties should fight for what they feel to be justice, at least, through violent resistance in an attempt to break out full-scale war?
Are you thinking of anywhere in particular?
I mean, for example, if you were going to pull out Hamas, they brought out violent resistance in probably a way that was not compliant with international law, but also with things like the Warsaw Uprising and violent resistance against slavery. Do you think those are an important method for peace generally?
Big question. We'll try and answer it in the couple of minutes we've got left. Kristin?
So there is
and thank you.
Thank you for your question. In the last few years, there's been quite a lot of work on the effectiveness of violent versus non-violent means to achieve your goals. And it's still a research agenda there's more and more work happening. But one of the key sort of things so far is that in general, so in conflicts where the goal is regime change, non-violent means, there's bit of evidence now suggesting that that's more effective towards achieving your goals, in the sense that you're not necessarily alienating the international community if you're using nonviolent means. It might also be garnering more people domestically might be willing to support you because there's less risk when the means are nonviolent. The evidence is less clear when it comes to territorial conflicts, whether that's the case. In fact, I think the latest suggests that violence actually is more effective there. So I'm not sort of giving you a sort of a normative sort of judgment. I'm just saying what the research is telling us. But it's a big research agenda.
Quick answer, Uilleam, please.
I think we touched on the question of justice before and war crimes trials and so on. I think that this just underlines the importance of having these effective mechanisms so that the sense of justice can be achieved without resorting to violence. But obviously, you know, it's quite an idealistic hope in many cases.
Ayse?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I'll just say, I understand like the drive for justice, but sometimes justice and, you know, peace don't go together. Like getting full justice may preclude having peace. So sometimes we need to compromise.
Richard?
Unfortunately, yeah.
Well, I'll just come back to the end of World War I. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States thought that he could eliminate conflict partly by the League of Nations, but partly, particularly, by the principle of national self-determination. That's to say, where you had one national group, like the Hungarians or the Czechs, whoever it might be, you just made them independent, gave them their own institutions and so on. And the problem was, of course, he didn't realize that they're not in neatly delineated areas. So every state that was created after World War I had really large national minorities in it, for one thing, and that sowed a huge amount of discontent and violence. And secondly, of course, the one state in Europe where that was denied were the Germans. They lost about 13% of their territory, and they weren't allowed to join in with German-speaking Austrians, who basically wanted to join in with them. And that, of course, gave an enormous amount of fuel and leverage to Hitler when he came to power. So it's a very complicated, justice is a very complicated thing when it comes to enforcing it or imposing it in practice.
Thank you all. We may not have given you the finite answer as to how wars end, but we have come to the end of our conversation. Can I thank the panel, and please a round of applause for them. Thanks to you for being here and being part of the Cambridge Festival. I can tell you that they've been filming up there, so very shortly the tape of this will, they call it a tape still? Will be put on, the recording of this will be put on the Cambridge Festival website, and you can watch it back gloriously as many times as you want. There's another debate, conversation coming up at 8 o'clock with the Astronomer Royal, so do come back for that. But thank you so much, everybody. Good night.